Welcome back to our yearly reading as we go through the Bible from cover to cover this year. And our desire is as you read, we want you to understand what you're reading. And so dig deep, ask hard questions, and do your study. But what I want to do is introduce each of these reading sessions to you with just what to be looking for. And so, of course, this time we're going to come through the book of Judges, chapter 12, and then we'll continue to the end of our reading. Here's what I want you to be looking for. We return to the northern campaign and we meet these judges who, again, remember, God raises judges to deliver the people from the oppression of their enemies, but only after the children of Israel basically became indifferent and rebelled against God. And the ongoing theme again and again is every man did what was right in his own eyes. Kind of sounds a little bit like our culture, does it not? So you're going to be introduced to the judges of Imzan, Elon, and Abdon. And during the same thing, other judges are going to be delivering God's people from this oppression because, again, they keep turning their back on God. And so this is their experience as they've already inhabited the promised land, but they keep doing the cosmic betrayal. So we get to read Samson's story in this section in chapters 13 to 16. And again, Samson was one of the judges of Israel who delivered the people from those who were called the Philistines, who basically were being oppressing the people of Israel. And so you're going to read about Samson's miraculous birth and his final failure, and it really is, it's a sad story. The last 5 chapters of Judges can be summarized on how Israel failed in sinning like the Canaanites in their idolatry, immorality, and their warring. And so the book ends with that sadness of real defeat. Again, this 350 years of a dark age as far as God's people not honoring God. But then sandwiched right inside of this era is a delightful book, contrast to the one we just read, Judges, and of course it's the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is a cameo story of love and devotion and redemption set in the context of the book of Judges. It's a story of a Moabite woman who forsakes her pagan heritage to stay with the people of Israel and believe in the God of Israel. Well, God blesses her loyalty and gives her a husband named Boaz, who's the son of Obed. She ends up being in the privileged position of being the great-grandmother of King David, and thus will be in the line of the Messiah. Well, the book of Ruth begins with her remaining with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi has 2 sons, and therefore 2 Moabite women marry her 2 sons. Naomi's 2 sons die. Naomi's husband dies, and so they're living in Moab at the time, but because it's now, the one daughter goes back to Moab in her pagan background. But Ruth wants to go with Naomi, and Naomi needs to return to Jerusalem because that's where she was from. And basically, Ruth decides to go with her. But both of these ladies, they have no husbands, no family other than each other, and so they're really destitute. But in Jerusalem, in Israel, there was a law that the poor were permitted to glean grain from the corners of the field. So those who owned fields, wheat fields, barley fields, after they were done, they'd leave the corners basically unharvested, so then the poor could come and harvest and be able to not die. And so one day, that's exactly what Ruth is doing. She, out of poverty, she's gleaning this barley or wheat for the purpose of herself and her mother-in-law. Well, basically, you could read the love story. It's a great story because Boaz finds out about her. Boaz falls in love with her. She falls in love with Boaz, and he redeems her from her plight. So that Ruth is redeemed by Boaz, marries her, later bears a son named Obed, who becomes the great-grandfather of King David, as I mentioned. And so the concept of the kinsman redeemer is introduced. In other words, you ever wonder where it says in Romans that you no longer have the spirit of a slave, but of adoption, a spirit of a child, like in 2 Corinthians 6, God says, I'll be a father to you and you'll be sons and daughters to me. See, Christians we may be, but God calls us his children. We are children, sons and daughters with a heavenly Father. So how did we get into the family of God? That's what this kinsman redeemer is all about. Jesus Christ, the kinsman redeemer, comes and redeems us out of our poverty and sin and brings us into his family, which is the family of God. That's the concept of kinsman redeemer, and that's what's illustrated here in the book of Ruth. Now, this week's reading concludes with the first 3 chapters of 1 Samuel. So now we move into this book describing the transition of leadership in Israel from judges, those years of darkness, to kings. You're going to be introduced to the last judge, who was actually the first prophet. His name was Samuel. And then you're also going to be introduced, because Samuel will anoint the first king of Israel, who will be Saul. And then later will be David, who will be the king elect by God after Saul's deep disappointment of ruling for God. Well, the book begins with the first transition of national leadership. Who is God using to bring direction, wisdom, and guidance to the whole nation, all the tribes? And at this point, it had been Eli, but now it's going to move to Samuel. And you're going to see in chapter 1 the remarkable birth of Samuel. You'll read about his mother Hannah's prayer and her remarkable dedication of Samuel in the temple of God to serve him for his life. And so in chapter 2, and then the formal transition of the leader of Israel from Eli to Samuel. And at this point, God will begin to direct Israel. But they want to be like the other nations. They want a king. They're going to come to Samuel demanding a king. Samuel takes it personally. But the reality is, God says, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. And that's going to move us into the rest of the book of 1 Samuel. And we'll pick that up next week. We'll dig deep this week. And remember, study. Show thyself a workman who need not be ashamed of himself, rightly dividing the word of truth. Enjoy your reading this week.